Hello, my name is Graham Clark. I'm a Canadian home inspector, professional engineer, and expert witness in the fields of construction and home inspection. In a recent video, I looked at a court case from Alberta where a home inspector was sued because they misidentified not only the condition of the roof, but the type of roof. In that case, the roof was a cedar roof, and the home inspector reported that there were some repairs needed, and in fact, it was a pine roof, and it was in an advanced state of deterioration. Ultimately, it needed to be replaced. If you want to know more about the technical details of that case, you can look up that other video. I'll include a link to it in the description here. But the case in question is Duncan versus Carson. It's a year 2000 decision in Alberta. And what I want to talk about today is how the judge determines that the home inspector was negligent. Was it just their opinion? How do they arrive at this conclusion? When home inspectors are sued, they're typically sued not through contract and not even through just general negligence. The specific test that is being applied to them is usually one of negligent misrepresentation. And that means that the home inspector has misrepresented the house in some way. They have either said, for example, that the roof is in good condition and it turns out that it is in poor condition. They've identified that the roof is, well, pine, and in fact it's actually cedar. So that type of thing. Misrepresentations can also be silent as well. So for example, if there is a basement which is leaking very badly, and if a home inspector doesn't say anything about it at all, that is a form of representation. And so they have misrepresented it. They should have pointed out that it was leaking, but they didn't. And they have misrepresented the condition of the home. Now, a home inspector can be wrong about something. That is allowed, but it can't be done negligently. And we're going to look at the test which is applied for negligent misrepresentation in Canada. And I'm just going to scroll down to the relevant part of this decision. And if you look up most home inspection cases, you're going to find some sort of discussion about negligent misrepresentation. And in this Duncan versus Carson case, you can see here we have it identified. This is the decision that the judge has written. The legal issues are twofold, and we're going to focus on this first one. Has the defendant made a negligent misrepresentation in the completion of this home inspection report? In the alternative, was the defendant in any way negligent in the preparation of the home inspection report? What they're focusing on here is they recognize that negligent misrepresentation is the most likely issue that the home inspector has, but just in case there's something else, fraudulent misrepresentation, for example, that might be a concern as well. And the second legal point here refers to exclusionary clauses. I'm going to deal with that in a future video. Well, the judge in this case does include, although there's some typos in it, the judge does include the terms of the Cognos Test. And the Cognos Test is a 5-point test in Canadian law to determine whether or not there has been negligent misrepresentation. And these 5 points, I'll go through them one by one. There must be a duty of care based on a special relationship between the person known as the representer and the person known as the representee. So there has to be, in our context, a duty of care between the home inspector and their client. Is there a duty of care? Does the home inspector have a responsibility to do their job properly and to prepare a proper report for their client? Yes, and that's a pretty easy one. It becomes a little more challenging to figure out in the context of a pre-listing inspection. I'll talk about that in a future video. But in this particular case, the home inspector was working for a client who was the buyer of the house. So it's pretty clear that they have a relationship. There is a duty of care between the home inspector and the client. The representation must be false, inaccurate, or misleading. Home inspector says the roof is pine, turns out it's actually cedar. Well, that's false, that's inaccurate, that's misleading. Number 3, and here's the tricky one, the representation must be made negligently. So let me give you an example of a misrepresentation which is not made negligently. Imagine we're inspecting a 1920s house. And in this 1920s house, it's been remodeled, completely renovated. I go down in the basement, I see an electrical panel, nice modern breaker panel, nice modern Romex wiring coming out of that. All the wiring I can see in the basement is nice new plastic sheathed NMD Romex wire. That's great. All the knob and tube wire has been removed from everywhere that I see. All right. Now I go walking around upstairs in the house and I get my circuit tester. I'm plugging my circuit tester into the receptacles, and there's lots of receptacles, like a modern amount of receptacles, one every 6 feet. I plug in my circuit tester, all of them are wired properly, and my circuit tester tells me that they're all grounded. And I go all the way up through the house. Everything's grounded, lots of receptacles, everything seems to be wired perfectly well. That's great. Now, the homeowners move in, they start to do a couple of more renovations. Their electrician discovers that, in fact, everything inside the walls is knob and tube wire. So during that former renovation, it seems that what somebody has done is they've concealed the knob and tube wire. They've replaced it all in the basement, and inside the walls, at the receptacles and switches, for example, they've taken the knob and tube and they've attached a couple of inches of Romex to the ends, and they've shoved that connection back into the wall, and they connected the neutral to the ground, something called a bootleg ground, and that's going to trick your regular circuit tester into thinking that's a grounded receptacle. Now, the standards of practice of ASHI, CAPI, all of the standard associations, they typically are going to require the home inspector to note or to describe the predominant branch circuit wiring. So in this home inspection report that was done, the predominant branch circuit wiring was regular NMD sheathed copper wire. No mention of knob and tube. Is that true? Well, actually, that's false. That's inaccurate. That's misleading. It turns out that the bulk of the wiring in the house was knob and tube wire. Right? So we've created a report which is false, inaccurate, or misleading. But was that made negligently? That's what the court has to decide. And typically what a court will require is they'll require some expert witnesses. And there might be an expert witness on both sides, both the plaintiff and the defendant. They write a report, they come to court, and they say, you know, the normal process for a home inspector to do an inspection is to use a circuit tester and test the electrical wiring. A home inspector will typically look at the wiring in the basement. A home inspector will not dig into the walls and go looking to see what type of wiring is inside the walls. And the experts might come up with one expert might say, for example, we don't remove any cover plates from receptacles. We don't remove any light switches from receptacles to have a look in behind to see what type of wiring is in there. Whereas the expert on the other side may say, you know what? It's my opinion that the duty of care expected of a home inspector is that in a house built in the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1910s, it's reasonable to expect a home inspector to maybe take a cover plate off one or two light switches and just to look inside there to see what type of wiring is in there, to see if there is any knob and tube wire. And I'm not going to take a position on that here. But the point is this issue of whether it was done negligently, what should the inspector have done, is typically settled with expert witnesses. And when there are no expert witnesses, the judge really has to figure it out for themselves, and they may have a great understanding of the duty of care of a home inspector. Most probably don't. So in the case where we just described knob and tube wiring not being found, well, that would be a misrepresentation, but it wouldn't be a negligent one, because in the scenario I've described, the home inspector did everything that a reasonable home inspector would do. They're not necessarily doing the best home inspection they possibly could have done, but are they meeting the standard expected of a competent practitioner in the market? And if the answer is yes, then they're not negligent. So you can be wrong, but it's still not negligent misrepresentation. Number 4, the representee team must have reasonably relied on the representation. And is a buyer client typically going to rely on the home inspection report? Yes, they typically are. They're always going to say that they did, and you can't really prove that they didn't. I mean, why would they pay a home inspector to come out and write a report on the condition of the house and not rely on it. And point number 5 is the reliance must have been detrimental with the consequence of the representee suffering damages. So the home buyer, the client, must have suffered some sort of loss. So you can be wrong, and you can be wrong negligently, but if there's no loss, well, there's no negligent misrepresentation. Here's an example where there may be no loss. A home inspector does a home inspection and he puts down in the report that all of the wiring in the house is aluminum and knob and tube wire and it needs significant repair. And in fact, it doesn't. It's all perfectly good, modern, well-installed copper wire. Well, that representation may be false, inaccurate, misleading, and it may have even been negligent. But there's no loss. Your client didn't suffer any loss. So what? So number 5 here would mean that there would be no negligence. So that's really what negligence means, and this is how home inspectors very often get sued, because they're not keeping up with the standards that other home inspectors are doing in their field. There is the standards of practice that we're always talking about in home inspection, those written down rules, those written down, you have to do this, you have to describe this, you're not required to do this type of thing or the other type of thing. But it's also worthwhile knowing what other home inspectors are doing in your area. It's also worth understanding what the most modern concerns are with respect to home inspection in your area. A number of years ago, I dealt with a case involving PEX piping. And these days, we recognize that certain brands of PEX piping, Plumb Better, Kitech, there were issues with these types of plumbing. And if I were going to walk into a house now and I saw Kitech piping, I would be telling my client about it and what the potential issues are. But would I have been talking about that in the year 2003, for example? Maybe it wasn't a well-known issue back then. And very often people get sued, home inspectors get sued for home inspections that were done many years ago. The point is, you do have to keep up on what the knowledge is amongst other people in your communities, going to conferences, attending seminars, things of that nature, joining an association and taking advantage of the educational offerings there, newsletters. You really have to keep up on your continuing education, which is why most home inspection associations require a minimum number of continuing education hours every year. Even if you don't require them because of an association, it's really a good idea to keep up on what's going on with houses, what's going on with home inspection. Are most home inspectors using a moisture meter? You should be using a moisture meter, because if you're not meeting that standard that some expert witness says is the norm in the industry, that's what may be leading you into negligent misrepresentation loss. Anyway, I hope that helps. In a future video, I'm going to talk probably pretty quickly about the limit of liability that existed in this particular case. It's very similar to a previous case that we talked about. As a matter of fact, very similar, but the judge looked at it a different way, but it still didn't help out the home inspector. We'll talk about that at a later time. Anyway, until then, I hope you learned something. I hope you found that useful. I hope I encouraged you to keep up on your continuing education game, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.